Captain James Carter had been flying for over 15 years, a seasoned professional with countless hours in the sky. But today, he was not in the cockpit. Today, he was a passenger, seated in economy class on a commercial flight, heading to a personal event. His uniform, pristine and sharp, reflected his status as a captain, and he had expected a certain level of respect from the airline. However, that morning, things were different. When he arrived at the gate, Captain Carter was directed to the boarding area like every other passenger. He glanced around, noticing a few familiar faces from past flights. As he approached the gate, he was greeted by a young flight attendant. She checked his ticket with a smile, but her expression quickly changed as she looked at the uniform. "Excuse me, sir," she said, hesitating. "You'll be sitting in economy today." Captain Carter, used to first-class seats and VIP treatment due to his status as a pilot, was taken aback. He had flown many times, but it was always in the comfort of the front cabin. There must have been some mistake, he thought. After all, he was a pilot too, a highly trained one. But the attendant's polite but firm words made it clear. There was no room for negotiation. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of confusion. The flight attendant, still smiling, nodded. "Yes, sir. We've had some changes to the seating arrangement, and the system shows your seat is in economy." James Carter paused for a moment. He could see the other passengers waiting in line behind him, some already eyeing the situation. A subtle but uncomfortable tension filled the air. The captain had expected to be treated with more respect, but here he was, being treated like any other passenger. Still, he smiled and nodded, deciding to let it go. After all, this wasn't a fight worth picking. He grabbed his bag and made his way down the narrow aisle of the plane. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority and respect, now felt almost out of place as he passed rows of passengers, many of whom were chatting, laughing, or settling into their own seats. As he reached the economy section, he noticed the stares. Some were quick and fleeting, while others lingered a little longer, as if they couldn't quite place why he looked so different. It wasn't every day that a pilot ended up in the back of the plane. His seat was toward the middle, a small window seat next to a young woman who was focused on her phone. She glanced up at him as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. The woman's eyes widened as she noticed his uniform. It didn't take long for her to realize who he was. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and surprise, and she immediately began to make small talk. "Are you a pilot?" she asked, her voice full of genuine interest. Captain Carter gave her a small, friendly smile. "Yes, I am. I'm just traveling like everyone else today." Her eyes widened even further. "That's amazing. You're a pilot, and you're sitting in economy. That's crazy." James chuckled softly, easing into the seat. "Sometimes things don't always go as planned, but I'm just happy to be on this flight like everyone else." The young woman didn't seem entirely convinced, but she smiled and returned to her phone, clearly intrigued but unsure what to make of the situation. Meanwhile, Captain Carter settled in, still feeling the oddness of the moment. The uncomfortable stares from passengers didn't help. Some of them were whispering, casting curious glances at him. He could tell they were trying to figure out why he, a pilot, was seated in such a mundane seat among them. There was a certain air of disbelief, as if it was impossible for someone like him to be a regular person, flying in the back like everyone else. As the flight took off, Captain Carter leaned back in his seat, looking out the window. The city below seemed far away, almost peaceful. The hum of the plane and the occasional sounds of chatter from other passengers filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd never imagined that a simple flight would make him feel so out of place. While the passengers around him seemed to settle in, some still unsure of what to make of him, Captain Carter couldn't help but feel a subtle sense of unease. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one making decisions or overseeing the flight. He was just another passenger, like everyone else. but the fact that he was a pilot in uniform seemed to make his presence in economy even more noticeable. There was an odd disconnect between the respect his uniform usually commanded and the reality of sitting in a cramped seat in the back of the plane. Captain James Carter had been flying for over 15 years, a seasoned professional with countless hours in the sky. But today, he was not in the cockpit. Today, he was a passenger, seated in economy class on a commercial flight, heading to a personal event. His uniform, pristine and sharp, reflected his status as a captain, and he had expected a certain level of respect from the airline. However, that morning, things were different. When he arrived at the gate, Captain Carter was directed to the boarding area like every other passenger. He glanced around, noticing a few familiar faces from past flights. As he approached the gate, he was greeted by a young flight attendant. She checked his ticket with a smile, but her expression quickly changed as she looked at the uniform. "Excuse me, sir," she said, hesitating. "You'll be sitting in economy today." Captain Carter, used to first-class seats and VIP treatment due to his status as a pilot, was taken aback. He had flown many times, but it was always in the comfort of the front cabin. There must have been some mistake, he thought. After all, he was a pilot too, a highly trained one. But the attendant's polite but firm words made it clear. There was no room for negotiation. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of confusion. The flight attendant, still smiling, nodded. "Yes, sir. We've had some changes to the seating arrangement, and the system shows your seat is in economy." James Carter paused for a moment. He could see the other passengers waiting in line behind him, some already eyeing the situation. A subtle but uncomfortable tension filled the air. The captain had expected to be treated with more respect, but here he was, being treated like any other passenger. Still, he smiled and nodded, deciding to let it go. After all, this wasn't a fight worth picking. He grabbed his bag and made his way down the narrow aisle of the plane. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority and respect, now felt almost out of place as he passed rows of passengers, many of whom were chatting, laughing, or settling into their own seats. As he reached the economy section, he noticed the stares. Some were quick and fleeting, while others lingered a little longer, as if they couldn't quite place why he looked so different. It wasn't every day that a pilot ended up in the back of the plane. His seat was toward the middle, a small window seat next to a young woman who was focused on her phone. She glanced up at him as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment and sat down. The woman's eyes widened as she noticed his uniform. It didn't take long for her to realize who he was. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and surprise, and she immediately began to make small talk. "Are you a pilot?" she asked, her voice full of genuine interest. Captain Carter gave her a small, friendly smile. "Yes, I am. I'm just traveling like everyone else today." Her eyes widened even further. "That's amazing. You're a pilot, and you're sitting in economy. That's crazy." James chuckled softly, easing into the seat. "Sometimes things don't always go as planned, but I'm just happy to be on this flight like everyone else." The young woman didn't seem entirely convinced, but she smiled and returned to her phone, clearly intrigued, but unsure what to make of the situation. Meanwhile, Captain Carter settled in, still feeling the oddness of the moment. The uncomfortable stares from passengers didn't help. Some of them were whispering, casting curious glances at him. He could tell they were trying to figure out why he, a pilot, was seated in such a mundane seat among them. There was a certain air of disbelief, as if it was impossible for someone like him to be a regular person, flying in the back like everyone else. As the flight took off, Captain Carter leaned back in his seat, looking out the window. The city below seemed far away, almost peaceful. The hum of the plane and the occasional sounds of chatter from other passengers filled the air. But his mind was elsewhere. He'd never imagined that a simple flight would make him feel so out of place. While the passengers around him seemed to settle in, some still unsure of what to make of him, Captain Carter couldn't help but feel a subtle sense of unease. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one making decisions or overseeing the flight. He was just another passenger, like everyone else. But the fact that he was a pilot in uniform seemed to make his presence in economy even more noticeable. There was an odd disconnect between the respect his uniform usually commanded and the reality of sitting in a cramped seat in the back of the plane. It wasn't as if he had expected them to know who he was, but the constant feeling of being under scrutiny felt strange. He wondered if they had ever seen a pilot outside of the cockpit before, or had they ever thought about what it meant for someone like him to be just like any other person, traveling for personal reasons, sitting in economy just like the rest of them. The flight attendants went about their duties, serving drinks and snacks, checking on passengers, but Captain Carter could sense a subtle shift in the way they treated him compared to other passengers. They were polite, but their gestures were cautious, almost hesitant. It wasn't until one of the flight attendants passed by that Captain Carter realized she was eyeing him, almost nervously. It was the same flight attendant who had greeted him earlier. She smiled briefly as she walked by, but it was an awkward smile, the kind that seemed to say, "I'm not sure what to do here, but I'm trying my best." It made Captain Carter laugh quietly to himself. The whole situation was beginning to feel a little surreal. He could sense that the flight attendants were probably wondering why a pilot was seated in economy, just like the passengers were. It wasn't that he was bothered by it, but there was a strange tension in the air, like he didn't belong there. But in reality, he knew he was just like any other person on that flight. He wasn't some celebrity or someone who demanded special treatment. He was simply Captain James Carter, a man who had chosen a career in the skies, just doing what he loved. As the plane continued its journey, Captain Carter leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find some peace in the midst of all the questions that were circling in his mind. There was something about the whole experience that made him think about how others viewed him, how they saw the uniform and made assumptions about who he was. But today, he was just a passenger, one of many, and that realization made him feel a little more grounded. The flight continued, and Captain Carter's mind drifted to the memories of past flights, of other passengers, other moments when the sky felt like home. But this time, things were different. He wasn't in control. And for now, he was okay with that. Captain James Carter looked out the window as the plane cruised high above the clouds. The endless sky stretched before him, and for a moment, it felt like he was back in his element, away from the odd stares, the whispers, and the questions. In the air, he was at peace. But down in the cabin, the situation was different. The uneasy feeling from before hadn't gone away. The young woman beside him, who had started the conversation earlier, was still lost in her phone, but every now and then, she glanced over at him with curiosity. It was as if she couldn't fully grasp the idea of a pilot sitting in economy class. Captain Carter could understand the confusion. He was used to the respect that came with being in charge of a flight. And now, he was just another face in the crowd. The contrast was striking. He had seen the way other passengers reacted, and though some tried to ignore him, others couldn't help but stare. It wasn't overtly rude, but the subtle glances were enough to make him feel like a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. His uniform, which usually commanded respect, seemed out of place in this part of the plane. People probably wondered why someone who was so clearly qualified to be in charge was sitting where they were. It made him realize how much people were defined by appearances and assumptions. Despite the awkwardness, Captain Carter wasn't one to dwell on negativity. He had learned long ago that the opinions of others were beyond his control, and that's why he'd always tried to lead by example. He had earned his place in the sky through hard work, and it wasn't about where he sat. It was about the work he did and the lives he was trusted to protect. He turned his attention back to the young woman next to him. She had put her phone down and was now looking out the window. The silence between them stretched for a moment before she spoke again. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she were testing the waters. "I mean, the responsibility, the lives of so many people in your hands. Captain Carter chuckled lightly, grateful for the shift in conversation. It's a lot of responsibility, sure, he said, his tone calm and reassuring. But you don't really think about it when you're up there. You're focused on the flight, on the instruments, the weather, and the crew. It becomes second nature after a while. It's just part of who you are. She nodded thoughtfully. That's really impressive. I can't even imagine the pressure. It must be stressful sometimes. It can be, he admitted, but that's why you train. You prepare for every situation, so when it happens, you're ready. It's not about handling the pressure in the moment. It's about handling it before it ever happens. The hardest part is staying calm and focused. The young woman smiled, her earlier curiosity replaced with respect. I can't imagine what that must be like. It's kind of like being a superhero. Captain Carter smiled back, but with a hint of modesty. I wouldn't go that far. I'm just doing my job, like everyone else. The conversation seemed to ease the tension, and for the first time since boarding, Captain Carter felt a sense of connection with someone. It wasn't a deep conversation, but it felt real. It was refreshing to talk to someone who didn't make assumptions based on his uniform, someone who genuinely wanted to understand what it was like to live his life. But as the plane continued its journey, he noticed that more passengers had started to take notice. Some weren't as subtle in their glances anymore. The whispers that had once been soft and fleeting were now louder, more frequent. Captain Carter tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being observed weighed on him. It wasn't the first time he'd dealt with people who saw him as a curiosity, but it was still uncomfortable. His thoughts were interrupted when a flight attendant walked by. She paused when she saw him, her eyes widening slightly. She was the same one who had checked him in earlier, and she seemed a little hesitant as she approached. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but nervous. "Is everything okay? Can I get you anything to drink?" Captain Carter smiled warmly, trying to put her at ease. "No, thank you. I'm good for now. Just enjoying the flight." The flight attendant nodded quickly, but there was something in her expression, something that said she wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. Maybe she was unsure about how to treat him. After all, he was a pilot, but he wasn't in charge of this flight. It had to be confusing for her. As she moved away, Captain Carter couldn't help but think about the unusual nature of the situation. He had never been in a position like this before, where he was just another passenger, where his uniform seemed to cause more questions than answers. He had spent years building his career, earning respect and admiration from his peers. But here, in this cabin, he was just a man on a plane. The thought didn't bother him as much as it would have before. In fact, he began to feel a sense of pride. He was used to being the one in charge, but today he wasn't. And that was okay. He realized that sometimes it was important to step back and be just another person, experiencing the same things as everyone else. It was a reminder that no matter how high he flew in his career, he was still just a human being. As the flight continued, Captain Carter tried to relax. He couldn't control the way people looked at him or what they thought of him, but he could control how he responded. And for today, he chose to be calm, patient, and understanding. Whether he was in the cockpit or seated in economy, he was still doing what he loved. And that was enough. The young woman beside him seemed to have found her peace too. She had gone back to her phone, but there was a new respect in her eyes when she looked at him. For the rest of the flight, they didn't say much more. But Captain Carter could feel the change in the air. The tension had eased, and even the other passengers seemed to settle down. It was as if they had all begun to see him for who he truly was, not just a man in uniform, but a person like them. And as the plane began its descent, Captain Carter knew that, despite everything, the journey had been worth it. Not just for the destination, but for the quiet realization that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be yourself. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm, with the hum of the engines and the occasional sound of passengers moving about the cabin. Captain James Carter had managed to calm his thoughts. He had long ago stopped worrying about the curious glances and quiet whispers from those around him. He had started to focus on the present moment, the flight, the people, the sounds. The sky outside the window was endless, and though he was just another passenger today, it felt good to be free from the constant responsibility of command. The young woman next to him had returned to her phone, but there was a comfortable silence now between them. She no longer seemed as uneasy or curious. It was clear that their conversation had shifted something between them, a quiet understanding that made the time pass more easily. He glanced at her and noticed she was scrolling through some photos, likely lost in her own world. As he leaned back in his seat, his mind wandered, replaying moments from his career, memories of days in the cockpit, of flights that had been calm, and others that had been anything but. But today, it wasn't about the professional side of things. It wasn't about the hundreds of passengers he'd safely transported or the countless flights he'd taken. It was about being in the moment, just another traveler, taking a break from the demands of the sky. But then, as the flight continued, a sudden shift in the air began to stir. It wasn't dramatic, but Captain Carter could feel the atmosphere in the cabin change. There was a subtle tension that wasn't there before, a slight unease that began to ripple through the passengers. He turned his attention back to the front of the plane. His eyes darted briefly to the flight attendants, who were moving up and down the aisle with their usual calm professionalism. But even they seemed a little more on edge than before. Captain Carter wasn't sure why, but he could sense that something wasn't quite right. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, soft and calm, but with an undertone of seriousness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence ahead. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We'll keep you updated as we continue on our course." Captain Carter immediately felt his senses sharpen. Turbulence wasn't uncommon, but the way the pilot had worded it, the slight urgency in his voice, it caught his attention. The plane rocked gently, and he could hear the faint sound of overhead compartments shifting, a small reminder that turbulence could be unpredictable. The young woman beside him, who had been scrolling through her phone, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Is this normal?" she asked quietly. Her voice was low, but it carried an edge of concern. Captain Carter nodded reassuringly. "It's just turbulence," he said, keeping his tone steady. "It happens sometimes. Nothing to worry about." She gave him a small nod but didn't look entirely convinced. The plane shuddered again, and there was a brief moment of unsettling silence, broken only by the quiet murmurs of other passengers. Captain Carter could feel the discomfort building in the cabin as the plane bounced through the air. He had flown through much worse before, but the atmosphere in the cabin made this feel different. As the turbulence continued, the flight attendants began to move with more urgency, checking on passengers and making sure everyone was seated and fastened. There was a sense of quiet organization, but even Captain Carter could tell they were preparing for something more serious. The seatbelt signs stayed on longer than usual, and there was a faint hint of tension in the air. The young woman next to him shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting nervously to the flight attendants, and then back to Captain Carter. "What happens if it gets worse?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Carter gave her a reassuring smile, though he couldn't help but feel the same uncertainty. "We're prepared for whatever comes. The crew knows what to do, and so do I." His words were meant to comfort her, but inside, he was already analyzing the situation. The turbulence was no longer just a minor inconvenience. There was something unusual about it. The plane had started to dip and rise in a way that wasn't typical for this flight path. The hum of the engines seemed to shift slightly with each movement, and Captain Carter could feel the subtle vibrations that made him more alert. He instinctively reached for the call button above him, pressing it lightly. The flight attendant who had checked on him earlier appeared almost immediately, her face a little more strained than before. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm a pilot," Captain Carter said calmly, keeping his voice steady. I noticed the turbulence is a bit unusual. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay in the cockpit." Her eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by his comment, but she nodded. "I'll check with the captain right away. Please stay seated and keep your seatbelt fastened." Captain Carter gave a nod, though his mind was already racing. He could sense the urgency in her voice. There was more happening than the average turbulence. As the flight attendant moved away, he turned back to the young woman beside him, who was still visibly shaken. "It's okay," he said again, trying to steady her nerves. "We'll be fine." She didn't respond immediately. Her attention now focused entirely on the flight attendants, who were hurriedly moving through the aisles, whispering to each other and scanning the passengers. It was clear that the calm demeanor of the crew was now beginning to crack under the pressure. Captain Carter was accustomed to the unexpected during flights, but this time, there was a new sense of urgency in the air. The turbulence had gone from uncomfortable to unsettling, and as the minutes passed, Captain Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He tried to push the worry aside, but his instincts as a pilot kicked in. It was in moments like these, when everything seemed just a little off, that experience and quick thinking mattered the most. He leaned forward in his seat, watching the flight attendants move through the cabin, making sure every passenger was okay, doing their best to stay calm. There was a collective sense of unease among the passengers, but Captain Carter knew that the most important thing to do now was stay focused. He had been trained for emergencies. He had dealt with much worse than this before, but for some reason, this felt different. And just as the plane rocked again, this time with a harder jolt, Captain Carter knew that things were about to get even more complicated. The challenge ahead would require every bit of his experience, and he was ready. Captain James Carter's instincts were sharp, and he could feel the atmosphere in the cabin shifting. The turbulence had intensified, and now it was no longer just a mild bump in the air. It was strong and unpredictable, the kind of turbulence that made even the most seasoned passengers uncomfortable. He could see the flight attendants moving swiftly down the aisles, their faces serious as they checked on everyone. They were trying to maintain a sense of calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. The young woman next to him, who had seemed so composed earlier, was now gripping the armrests with both hands. Her knuckles were white, and her eyes were wide with concern. She glanced at Captain Carter, as if searching for reassurance. He gave her a reassuring smile, though his own mind was focused on the situation unfolding around them. He had been in much worse conditions during his career, but something about this felt different. The plane jolted again, and this time it felt stronger. Passengers gasped, and some even let out quiet murmurs of fear. Captain Carter could feel the unease spread through the cabin. He had to admit, this turbulence was more intense than usual. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't the only one who could sense it. The flight attendants were now visibly on edge, moving quickly and purposefully through the cabin, checking to make sure everyone was securely fastened in their seats. The flight attendant who had first checked on him earlier was making her way down the aisle again, her face pale. She stopped by Captain Carter's seat, her eyes betraying a hint of worry. "Sir, I need to speak with the captain," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "There's something happening up front. We're not sure if it's a mechanical issue or if the turbulence is just affecting the plane in a way we didn't expect. I need to let him know about the situation." Captain Carter nodded. "Go ahead," he replied, trying to keep his own voice calm. But inside, his thoughts were racing. The turbulence wasn't normal, and the fact that the flight attendants were acting more urgently only confirmed his suspicions. It was one thing for passengers to feel uneasy, but when the crew started reacting differently, that was when he knew things had taken a turn. The flight attendant hurried away, and Captain Carter turned back to the young woman sitting beside him. She was still gripping the armrests, her body tense. He could feel her anxiety, and it made him realize that, no matter how calm he appeared on the outside, the passengers around him were depending on him to keep them calm. He leaned over slightly, speaking softly. "Listen, it's going to be okay. You're safe, and the crew is doing everything they can. Turbulence can feel frightening, but we've been trained for this. Just stay calm, and everything will be fine." The young woman nodded, but her eyes still looked worried. "I've never been on a flight like this before," she said. "I didn't think it could be this bad." "I understand," Captain Carter replied, "but you're not alone. Everyone on this plane is here to make sure we get through this safely. That includes me." The plane jerked again, and this time it was followed by a deeper rumble that seemed to reverberate through the entire cabin. Captain Carter could feel the tension rise even further. The young woman beside him gasped, her face pale, and he could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't the typical flight anymore. This was something more serious, something that required all the focus and calm he could muster. He quickly scanned the cabin, taking in the reactions of the passengers. Some were clutching their armrests. Others had their eyes closed, praying for the turbulence to stop. A few passengers were even whispering to one another, as if trying to figure out what was happening. Captain Carter's eyes then moved to the flight attendants, who were still moving swiftly, but now they were gathered near the galley, speaking in hushed tones. Something wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the flight attendants' actions, combined with the unrelenting turbulence, told him that they were preparing for something more than just a bumpy ride. He reached for the call button above him, pressing it lightly. The same flight attendant who had approached him earlier appeared almost immediately. Her expression was more serious now. "Sir, we've contacted the cockpit, but there's no response from the captain," she said, her voice strained. "We're having trouble getting in touch with him." Captain Carter's heart skipped a beat. That was unusual. Even during the most intense turbulence, the communication between the crew and the cockpit should be constant. Something was wrong. "I'll go up to the cockpit," Captain Carter said, his voice firm. "I can help. I'm a pilot." The flight attendant hesitated, looking unsure. "But sir, you're just a passenger. We don't know what's going on up there." "I know the situation. I can handle it," Captain Carter replied, standing up from his seat. He was already moving toward the front of the plane, determined to find out what was going on. The flight attendant seemed reluctant but stepped aside, allowing him to pass. As Captain Carter made his way through the narrow aisles, he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. Their nervous glances followed him as he moved forward. The flight attendants were still trying to maintain control of the cabin, but the tension was thick, and it was clear that something wasn't right. Captain Carter reached the cockpit door and knocked gently. There was no answer. He knocked again, this time harder, but still nothing. A wave of unease washed over him. He knew the cockpit was supposed to be locked, but this was different. Something had happened, and the crew was no longer able to communicate. Without hesitation, Captain Carter reached for the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, ready for whatever awaited him. What he found inside the cockpit was not what he expected. The instruments were flashing, and the captain and first officer were both in their seats, but they were unconscious. The cockpit was in chaos. Captain Carter didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, taking charge of the situation. He knew what he had to do. It was time to take control of the plane. As the reality of the situation settled in, Captain Carter knew that his training, experience, and calm under pressure were the only things standing between the passengers and danger. He was about to lead this flight through the most critical moments it had ever faced. Captain James Carter stood frozen for a moment in the cockpit, his mind racing. The situation before him was unlike anything he had faced in his long career. The two pilots, who should have been in control of the flight, were slumped over in their seats, unconscious. The instruments on the dashboard were flashing erratically, some lights blinking with urgency, others glowing ominously. The hum of the engines, once a comforting background noise, now seemed almost too loud, vibrating through the very walls of the cockpit. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly assessed the situation. The plane was flying itself, but that wouldn't last forever. If the autopilot wasn't adjusted, or if another malfunction occurred, things could quickly spiral out of control. He knew what he had to do. Captain Carter moved swiftly, his training kicking in. He approached the first officer's seat, checking the man's pulse with a quick but practiced motion. The young first officer's breathing was shallow but steady, though he showed no signs of waking up. Captain Carter then moved to the captain's seat, repeating the same process. The senior pilot was in a similar state, unconscious but alive. That was a small relief, but it didn't help the situation they were in. He quickly turned his attention back to the flashing controls. They weren't just signals of turbulence anymore. They were signs of a malfunction. There was an issue with the aircraft's stabilization system, and if left unchecked, it could lead to a much worse outcome. Captain Carter knew what was at stake. He reached out and carefully flipped a few switches on the control panel, adjusting the autopilot and stabilizing the aircraft. It was a delicate balance between keeping the plane on course and correcting the issue that had caused the sudden loss of control. Every second counted. The plane had been bouncing through turbulence before, but now it was like a ship caught in a storm, listing dangerously. His hands moved quickly and decisively, familiar with each control, each button, each lever. He had trained for situations like this, but it was still different when you were actually in the cockpit, facing the problem head-on. The minutes felt like hours as he worked to stabilize the flight. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he kept his focus sharp. The flashing lights slowly began to subside, but there was no time to relax yet. Outside the cockpit, the plane continued its rough ride through the sky. The cabin had fallen silent, save for the occasional whisper of fear. The young woman who had been sitting next to Captain Carter earlier was no doubt still feeling the tension. He could only hope that his presence in the cockpit would give the passengers some sense of reassurance. As he continued to work through the issues with the plane, his thoughts briefly turned to the flight attendants. He hoped they were keeping the passengers calm. The crew had a responsibility to make sure everyone felt safe, and he couldn't afford to think about anything other than what was happening in the cockpit right now. Captain Carter pulled the emergency oxygen masks into place for the pilots, securing them for a moment of stability. The turbulence had shaken the plane hard, and while it was necessary for the autopilot to adjust, the oxygen systems would need to kick in soon to avoid any further complications. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the instruments began to stabilize. The flashing stopped, and the unsettling hum of the engine softened. Captain Carter let out a slow breath, his body tense but relieved. The plane was back on course, and the turbulence was finally starting to die down. He leaned back in his seat for just a moment, grateful that the immediate danger had passed, but there was still a long way to go before the plane was safely on the ground. His mind raced with the tasks ahead, checking the systems one last time to make sure they were fully operational. Captain Carter's hands moved over the control panel with practiced ease. He'd been through worse situations before, but this was something different. His decision-making had been swift, but it had been under incredible pressure. The fact that he was now alone in the cockpit made it clear that he had to finish what had been started. He keyed in a few commands to double-check the plane's route. The autopilot had been fixed, but he needed to make sure the system wouldn't fail again. The engine speed was stable, and there didn't seem to be any more erratic behavior in the controls. The flight attendants were probably unaware of just how close things had come to going wrong, but he needed to get the plane back on track and inform them that everything was okay. His mind quickly ran through the list of things that still needed to be done. His first priority was to inform the crew and get in touch with the airline support team. There would be an investigation into the failure of the plane's systems later, but for now, the focus was on keeping everyone on board safe. Captain Carter keyed the radio to communicate with air traffic control. His voice came out steady, the calm tone of a seasoned pilot. "This is Captain Carter. I've regained control of the flight, and we're back on course. We had an issue with the stabilization systems, but it's been resolved. Requesting permission to continue our flight plan." There was a moment of silence before air traffic control came back with confirmation. "Roger, Captain. We got you back on track. Continue on your flight path, and we'll monitor your progress. Let us know if you need anything." Captain Carter nodded, even though they couldn't see him. His focus was now entirely on the flight, making sure everything was operating smoothly. He reached over to the intercom and made an announcement for the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to reassure you that we've encountered a slight technical issue, but it has been resolved. We are back on course and expect smooth skies ahead. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened, and thank you for your patience." He knew his words would provide a sense of calm, but he also knew the passengers were likely still feeling the aftereffects of the turbulence. He couldn't blame them. This had been an unsettling experience for everyone. With the situation under control for now, Captain Carter turned his attention back to the crew in the cabin. He needed to make sure that they were informed and ready for any further issues. But for the moment, the flight was back on track, and he had done what needed to be done. The sense of relief was temporary, but the knowledge that he had been able to handle the situation kept him steady. The job wasn't finished yet, but one thing was certain. He wasn't just a passenger on this flight anymore. He was in control. Captain James Carter sat back in the cockpit, his hands still resting on the controls, but his mind was moving a mile a minute. He had successfully regained control of the plane, but there was no mistaking the fact that this flight was far from over. The turbulence had passed, but the situation was far from normal. The other pilots were still unconscious, and while he had managed to fix the immediate technical issues, the question of what had caused them lingered in the back of his mind. The silence in the cockpit felt heavy. The plane was now flying smoothly, but Captain Carter knew that they were still far from their destination, and there was a lot to be done. He needed to make sure the rest of the flight went smoothly, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He reached for the radio again, signaling air traffic control to update them on the current situation. "This is Captain Carter. The aircraft is back on course, and the systems are stable. We're continuing our flight path. I'll be taking over for the remainder of the flight." There was a brief pause before air traffic control responded. "Roger that, Captain. You are cleared for your current route. We'll monitor from here. Let us know if you require any assistance." He nodded to himself, though no one could see him. The reassurance from air traffic control was helpful, but Captain Carter knew it was just a small part of the bigger picture. The problem hadn't been solved. It had only been contained for the time being. The systems were functioning now, but what if the malfunction returned? What if there was a bigger issue lurking underneath the surface? He took a deep breath and focused on the task ahead. The plane was flying steadily, and he had no reason to believe there would be any further problems in the immediate future. But the sense of unease still hung in the air, and it wasn't just because of the technical issue. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the weight of responsibility was something he couldn't ignore. The young woman who had been sitting beside him earlier, he wondered how she was doing. The plane had been bouncing around violently when he'd taken over, and while the turbulence was gone now, he imagined that many passengers were still on edge. It wasn't just the physical strain of the flight, it was the mental toll that came from the uncertainty. He knew that when they landed, the crew and passengers would want answers. They would want to know what had happened, why the plane had gone off course, and why the flight had taken such a dramatic turn. He reached for the intercom and made another announcement, his voice calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. I wanted to take a moment to assure you that everything is under control. We've encountered a technical issue, but it has been resolved. The plane is now flying smoothly, and we expect no further disruptions. Please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until we reach our destination. Thank you for your patience." Captain Carter could hear the faint murmur of passengers in the cabin, some of them still unsettled. He didn't expect instant calm. What they had just gone through was not something that could be forgotten easily. But he hoped his words had made a difference. The passengers needed to feel safe, and that was his responsibility now. He turned his attention back to the cockpit, his mind once again drifting to the problem at hand. The cause of the malfunction was still unknown, and that bothered him. It wasn't like him to leave loose ends, especially when lives were at stake. He had worked with planes long enough to know that any issue, no matter how small, could lead to something bigger if left unchecked. But there wasn't much he could do right now. The most important thing was to keep the plane flying safely until they could land and get the crew the medical attention they needed. He glanced at the unconscious pilots again. They were still slumped in their seats, their bodies untouched by the chaos that had unfolded. Captain Carter felt a pang of guilt for not being able to do more for them, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were passengers depending on him, and he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. The minutes ticked by, and as the plane continued on its course, Captain Carter's focus never wavered. His hands remained steady on the controls, and his eyes flicked back and forth between the instruments, monitoring the systems closely. Every sound, every flicker of the lights, every vibration from the engines, it all mattered now. He couldn't afford to take his eyes off anything. He was still in charge of this flight, and the weight of that responsibility settled firmly on his shoulders. He thought back to his early days as a pilot, when he had first entered the cockpit. It had been a dream come true then, and it still was, in many ways. But now, as he looked at the two unconscious pilots, he realized how fragile that dream could be. No one was invincible. Every decision, every action, carried consequences, and sometimes those consequences were more than anyone could anticipate. He glanced back at the crew again. The flight attendants were still moving through the cabin, offering whatever comfort they could to the passengers. They had done a remarkable job keeping things under control while he had been focused on the plane. Captain Carter knew they were just as shaken by the events as the passengers were, but they were still doing their best to keep everyone calm. He had no idea how long it would take for the plane to reach its destination. The timeline was still up in the air, depending on how much longer the systems would remain stable. But he knew he had to keep the plane flying safely, even if it meant taking on more than anyone expected. Captain Carter finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The worst of the immediate danger had passed, and though he was still far from his destination, he knew he had the skills to get them there safely. He would find out what went wrong, and he would make sure it never happened again. For now, though, he needed to focus on what mattered most, getting the plane back on the ground, with every passenger safe and sound. As the plane continued its smooth course through the sky, Captain James Carter felt a sense of calm gradually return to the cockpit. The turbulence had subsided, and though he had already handled the immediate crisis, he knew the flight wasn't over yet. The crew was still unconscious, and although the systems were stable for now, there was a lingering uncertainty about what had caused the malfunction. His mind kept racing with questions, but he had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was essential to remain focused. The sound of the engines hummed steadily in the background as Captain Carter surveyed the instruments in front of him. Everything was functioning properly at the moment, but he knew better than to assume that meant the worst was behind them. The flight was still a long one, and he had to be ready for anything. He needed to stay sharp, alert to any changes in the plane's behavior. His thoughts shifted momentarily to the passengers. He could only imagine how shaken they must have been, and though the plane was now flying smoothly, the earlier chaos had certainly left a mark. He had done his best to reassure them, but the reality was that their sense of safety had been shaken. The turbulence, combined with the loss of communication with the cockpit, had likely raised concerns in the cabin. It wasn't the kind of flight anyone would forget easily. Captain Carter glanced at the small window beside him, taking in the view of the sky. It was vast and open, a reminder of the power of nature and the responsibility that came with flying. The wide, unbroken horizon was calming, but it also served as a reminder of the task at hand. The sky was beautiful, but it could also be unpredictable, and the safety of everyone on board depended on his ability to anticipate and respond to whatever came next. He thought back to the young woman sitting next to him earlier, the one who had been so uneasy about the turbulence. He hadn't heard from her in a while, and he hoped she was feeling better now. It was hard to forget the look of worry in her eyes as the plane had rocked back and forth. She had been understandably afraid, and Captain Carter had tried his best to calm her, to remind her that everything was under control. He hoped his words had made a difference, but he knew it would take more than reassurance to ease the fears of everyone on board. He turned his attention back to the cockpit. The other pilots were still unconscious, and while it had been necessary for him to take over, he couldn't ignore the fact that they needed medical attention. There was still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the cause of the technical issues, and if there was any chance of it happening again, the plane would need to be thoroughly checked as soon as possible. Captain Carter had a responsibility to the crew as well as to the passengers, and he wouldn't rest until everyone was safe and accounted for. After a few more minutes of observation, he keyed the radio again, contacting air traffic control. "This is Captain Carter. I'm continuing on the current flight path. We're on schedule, and all systems are stable. Requesting priority landing instructions for when we arrive." The response came almost immediately. "Understood, Captain. You're cleared for landing once you approach. We'll have the medical team ready for you on the ground. We're monitoring your flight closely." That response brought a small measure of relief. The medical team would be there when they landed, ready to assist both the crew and any passengers who might need attention. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. Captain Carter knew the situation wasn't over yet, but knowing that help would be available when they landed helped to ease some of the weight on his shoulders. As he continued to pilot the aircraft, his focus remained fixed on the task ahead. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Every second mattered. The plane had been through a great deal, and now, more than ever, it was vital that he remained calm and collected. Minutes passed, and Captain Carter's thoughts shifted once more to the passengers. He thought of the young woman next to him, the other people who had been on the flight, all of them silently hoping for reassurance. His responsibility to them had never been clearer. He had to get them home safely, and that meant doing everything in his power to keep things under control. The turbulence was over, but the emotional impact it had left on the passengers would take time to heal. Captain Carter knew that once they landed, there would be many questions. What had caused the sudden loss of communication from the cockpit? What had caused the malfunction in the plane's systems? Why had both pilots been rendered unconscious? These were all questions that needed answers, and he would be the one to provide them. But for now, there was one thing that mattered more than anything else: getting the plane on the ground without incident. The flight seemed to stretch on for an eternity, but Captain Carter stayed focused. His mind wandered only briefly, as the responsibilities of the moment reminded him of the delicate balance between caution and action. He had been a pilot for years, and this was one of the most challenging flights he had ever experienced. Yet he knew this was the job. This was what he had trained for. As the plane began its descent, the familiar hum of the engines grew louder, and the subtle vibrations of the aircraft reminded him that they were on their way home. The passengers, still unaware of the full extent of what had happened, would soon be able to disembark and resume their lives, leaving behind this unexpected chapter of their journey. Captain Carter didn't know how long it would take for them to fully understand the gravity of the situation, but he hoped that they would leave the flight knowing one thing: they were safe, and he had done everything in his power to make sure of that. The moment the wheels hit the tarmac and the plane came to a complete stop, Captain Carter felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. It had been a long, tense journey, but they had made it. The emergency vehicles were already lined up along the runway, the lights flashing brightly in the darkening sky. The flight crew would be taken to the hospital, and the passengers would be escorted to the terminal. Captain Carter took one last breath, his hand still gripping the controls. It was over. They had made it.